Welcome to another edition of Around the Coin. I am your host, Faisal Khan. I feel privileged to have with us today the Oracle of Payments and Identity with us today, the great David or Dave Birch. Dave is truly a multi-talented person. He is the author of Identity is the New Money, which was his book that came out in 2014. He's a public speaker, world traveler, and needless to say, a consultant in the payment space, and works with Consult Hyperion. In our pre-show discussion today with David, he hinted about a new book he is writing, so we will have him say a few words about that as well. And without any further delay, here's David. Hello, Dave. How are you? Nice to have you on the podcast, and thank you for taking the time out.
No problem. I was flattered to be invited. You know, I've said to you before, yours is one of the few podcasts that I listen to every single episode. So
thank you very much.
I was delighted to be asked to be on it.
Well, it seems you are the resident guru when it comes to payments and identity. It's a subject that very many people don't seem to take too seriously these days. I don't know why, but when you talk about identity, there's sort of it's a boring subject. There's nothing left to be solved in identity, which is where I beg to differ. So my first question.
That's right.
My first question to you: when it comes to identity, and especially identity in payments, why is it so important? What are some of the areas you feel need addressing?
Well, I mean, there are two sides to that coin, so to speak. If I could get a hilarious pun in right at the beginning. There are two sides to that coin. So on the one hand, where we have identity in transactions, the whole thing's a complete mess, right? So 20 years downstream from the old cartoon, in cyberspace, no one's you're a dog. We really haven't made very much progress on this. If you look at the figures, whether it's card fraud or banking fraud or account takeover or whatever it is you're looking at, the fraud figures keep rising inexorably. We don't seem to be making much of a dent on that. And the costs of managing identity insofar as we have it, so this is called the costs of KYC and things like this, are astronomical. So where we have identity in transactions, it's not working terribly well, and it's costing us a lot of money. The other side of that coin, of course, is that for most transactions, we actually shouldn't be using identity at all, let alone the wrong kind of identity. So for a great many transactions, your identity, or I should more generalize and say the identities of the counterparties, are the least important thing about a transaction. So it all seems a bit silly that, if I come to your website and I want to spend $10 on a bit of shareware, I have to type in my credit card number, my name and address, all sorts of personal things about me, thus creating yet another place where they can be stolen from. In this instance, your website. So you see, we have so the two sides of the coin are the two problems. Where we use identity, we haven't got it right. And on the other side of the coin, we shouldn't be using identity, but we are. So those two problems both need fixing.
I mean, I was researching about identity, especially with respect to banking and financial services, which is a space, obviously, you're an expert in. And I went back and I wanted to find out, the KYC that we do today with respect to banking, when did it get introduced, really? And it turns out, at least from my research, that shortly after World War I, the accounts that were being opened in banks and brokerages across the U.S., started taking this basic information, name, date of birth, the address. Social Security wasn't invented by then. And for some odd reason, that template still exists today. 90 years later, we haven't changed it. And today it's almost a foregone conclusion that is the kind of information you need to provide.
Well, in a weird way, if you want the sort of big picture version of this, we're going back, or if we were using the technology properly, we would be using the technology to go back to a time before that. What I mean by that is, a long time ago, everybody knew everybody else, right? So the bank manager or the money lender or the remitter in your village knew everybody, and everybody knew him. He didn't need KYC because he knew who you were. And then we have industrial revolution. We have a period of urban anonymity, which we still use actually, I think, as the wrong template for what privacy is, but that's a separate point. And we needed these kind of sort of mechanized proxies for the knowledge that used to be in the guy's head. So now we have to start making databases and collecting information, all this sort of thing. And we use identity as a proxy into those imperfect databases as a substitute for the attributes that we actually want to know about. So, and we've been mechanizing and now digitizing, that kind of thinking. But if you think about what's happening because of the new superpowers that have been afforded us by the invention of the mobile phone and social networks and cryptography, when you look at what's happening there, in a weird kind of way, we're going back to that old world where everybody knows everybody else. It used to be because you physically, were co-located with them, the members of your village, and you physically knew them. But of course now that reputational knowledge and the calculus that it affords comes through digital networks, social media, mobile phones. So if you look at the big picture, we're actually going back, I think, to that previous mode where everybody knew everybody else. Now, can you see what I mean by that?
I do.
By that loop, yeah. So now, obviously, there's a couple of aspects to that which are going to be different in this world, and I think it's interesting to sort of reflect on how those might evolve, because I don't know what the answer to that is. But the first thing is, in the village where everybody knew everybody else, there was no such thing as privacy at all. And maybe that's the mode that we have to think ourselves into. Maybe that is the future. I'm not quite prepared to give up on that just yet. So I maintain that it ought to be possible to structure the way that identity infrastructure works so that the virtual identities that are interacting online can be, essentially pseudonymous where necessary. So whereas when I'm in the village with you, you know that I'm Dave Birch. When you and I are both in the Manchester City Supporters Club online discussion group, right, then I'm fan 1 and you're fan 2, and you develop a reputation, and I'm very interested in what you say because fan 1 always says interesting things. He's quite often right about things. But I don't actually know who you are. I know the reputation, but the identity has been decoupled from it. And I think that's one area where we should construct a better infrastructure.
I mean, I heard from one of your podcasts, you mentioned something about identity being intelligent, or lack of it being intelligent, where you said, for example, if when you pay at a bar or when you're entering a bar, you just need to know that you're over 18 and no other additional information needs to be shared.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, this is Kim Cameron's law of minimal disclosure that he made part of his 7 laws of identity all those years ago, which I support very strongly. If you spray around personal information all over the place as the lubricant for any number of transactions, sooner or later it will be purloined, right? Mm-hmm. So if you tell the bar your date of birth, eventually your date of birth will be stolen from the bar. But the crucial point, of course, is that the bar didn't actually want to know your date of birth. What they wanted to know was whether you're over 21 or not, and that's a completely different issue. So given the advances in cryptography and authentication, all these other kind of things, if my goal is to prove that I'm over 18 or over 21 or over 37, mm-hmm. I can do that without giving away my actual age, and then my age can't be stolen. So you see, you have these. So sort of, I know it's a kind of flip thing to say, but it's like technology is returning us to the village or to the Neolithic clan. But of course, it's not quite, because we're going to use the technology to build in one or two different things. like the privacy and so on.
But do we have the technology today to implement these kind of minimal disclosures?
Yes, I mean, actually, I think the technology side of it is actually the kind of most optimistic side of it, because we all understand how to use public keys and certificates and zero knowledge proofs and all this kind of thing to implement those. I do think there's a slight issue at the moment because it's the technologists that understand how those things work, and the regulators and society in general doesn't. So as a consequence, it's the technologists who are sort of setting the dial, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the wrong way round. So society should be saying, this is how we want identity to work online. We want full disclosure, or we want pseudonymity, or we want conditional anonymity, or we want full anonymity, or however they want it. It's for society to decide how it wants identity to work, and then for technologists to build it so that it works that way. And right now, it's sort of the other way around. So you have people building different kinds of systems, and then the users have to use whatever has been built. So, I mean, we need a more mature and sophisticated debate on that.
I mean, it almost.
And I'm always looking, Faisal. I'm always looking for ways to make that debate human and take it out to the regulators and to the policymakers.
I mean, it seems a natural fit today that, the village example you cite is more or less of a variable identity, right? It's based on the interaction, that amount of identity is shared or disclosed. And somehow we have set ourselves today the slider at full disclosure, and that's it, and there's nothing more or nothing less.
Yes, I think that's right. It's just sort of one other thing to throw into that. I mean, if I'm going to torture the village metaphor to its absolute limits, of course, in the modern world, we don't live in a village. We live in multiple simultaneous villages, because the only community that we participated in Neolithic times was the limited geographic one. Mm-hmm. Whereas, of course, now I'm in an online fintech community with you, as well as the physical community of Woking. I'm in a virtual community of Barclays Bank users. I'm in a community of
Twitter
people who post abuse about the Chancellor of the Exchequer on Twitter. I'm in a community. You know what I mean? Now we're all in multiple communities, and we may want to present different identities and attributes to each of those communities. In fact, I think we should, because the partitioning of our identity across those different communities is a fundamental defense. But I think the basic idea holds. In a weird way, technology is taking us back to a reputational economy.
So that's a deep thought, reputation of the economy.
Well, in the old days, actually, let me give you a different example. Well, an example I like using at the moment, because it's in the headlines because of the Indian ongoing experiment with cashlessness, which is very fascinating to people like me, and will undoubtedly be a business school case study for years to come.
Yeah, absolutely.
In this example, I was reading in a newspaper, and it said, well, there were people queuing up at ATMs, and people couldn't sell anything at the market, and commerce was grinding to a halt, and all that sort of thing. I mean, that actually doesn't seem to have happened. I've spoken to a couple of people who came back from India recently, and they seemed to indicate that life was going on as normal. It's like, it can't be as bad as they were making out. But nevertheless, the cash disappears from the economy. What happens? Well, we have another case study of that actually happened, because in the 1970s in Ireland, there was the very famous case of the bank strikes, where the whole country, within a couple of days, ran out of money. And yet academic
came out, basically.
Exactly. So academic research on the impact of that on the economy showed that it had actually surprisingly little impact, because people would just write each other IOUs and business would carry on. Now, how was it that people were able to write out IOUs to each other? Because it was a more rural, more localized economy in those days, so people knew each other. So they were perfectly capable of calculating on the basis of counterparty reputations how much credit to extend in a transaction or what the terms would be or that kind of thing. I know you. And so if you say to me, oh, I haven't got any money, can I pay you next week? I'm fine, right? But if I don't know you, how am I going to make that calculation? We've just been through a period where the rudimentary technology we had available to us, index cards and filing cabinets and the internet and PCs and things, means that we use credit bureaus and FICO scores and all that sort of thing. But we're moving into an era where we'll go back to the reputation. If I want to know about you, I don't care what FICO says about you or whether you didn't pay back a credit card loan 25 years ago. I'll go on LinkedIn and see what people say. Like Facebook, Twitter would tell me more about you. We have a very interesting case study ourselves because we have an office in New York. And when you transfer people over to New York, and in fact this happened to me the first time I went to work in the States as well, the bank wouldn't give me a credit card because despite the fact I'd had a job for years and was well paid and all this sort of thing, I didn't have
to America.
I was new. I didn't have one of their dumb credit score things. So whereas of course if the bank manager spent 2 seconds looking at my LinkedIn profile, it would be transparently obvious to him whether he should lend me any money or not. So this idea that the cash begins to disappear, you begin to work in these more reputational ways. That seems to me not a crazy prediction. That seems to me a trivial extrapolation of how technology is coming together at the moment. Yeah. If all of the money vanished, life would go on, and I think India actually is proving.
I don't think so. We will be in a crisis as as one would predict or one would hope so.
Well, I think that's true. Yeah.
But it almost brings me back to a very famous quote that is actually on your book. Identity is the new money, which is actually the title of your book. Tell me a little bit about the book.
Well, the book started as because I'd given a few.
I'd like to interject here and let you know that there is, at least I could not find any other book on the internet or on Amazon that actually deals with identity the way you have in your book. And I think it's
Thank you.
Literally a monopoly right now. I think you have on identity.
And long may it continue. Thank you very much. No, I mean, look, you have to remember the origin of these things. I'm the front man for this stuff, right? But I work in an office with super smart guys who are out working at the forefront of this field and have been for a long time. So you can go back 20 years to the time when our guys were working on the specifications for the Hong Kong smart identity card. I mean, it goes back that far. And when we first started working in this space, I'm a smart guy. I can see that things don't work quite the way they should be. And I began to formulate one or two ideas, test it out with the people that I work with. About 10 years ago, I was the editor of a book called Digital Identity Management, which had some chapters and case studies supplied by a variety of different people, not just the guys I worked with. And that helped me to crystallize some of the ideas more. And then when we went through the sort of mobile phone, social media, that kind of revolution a few years ago, that made me realize that some of the ideas that had been bubbling around were actually right, and it was time to sort of crystallize some of them. And that's why I sat down to write the book. I realized that identity is the new money is a little bit of a sort of bumper sticker, and of course the reality is more complex. But if I'd have tried to call the book reputational calculus based on social networks will be the fundamental enabler of transactions, the publishers don't like that sort of thing. Identity is the new money is much better. But thank you for the kind comments. I just want to point out that I may have crystallized some of this stuff, but I relied on a lot of smart people to bounce the ideas around to get them.
I mean, one thing I keep reading, I mean, identity is a very fragmented space when it comes to worldwide. I mean, IDs cannot be passported, so to speak. If at least in the banking world, there are some instances that they are now being accepted in the EEA, which is the European Economic Area, but worldwide we do not have the equivalent of, let's say, one ID. Like your one single login from Facebook can get you logged in at hundreds of different of other web properties. Do you see that happening? Do you see the ID becoming so tokenized and so separated, but yet so portable that it can be passported to other applications, other financial mediums, other countries, and so forth?
Well, I think there is growing interest in what you could probably label, some kind of financial services passport of some kind. So the problem of trying to fix everything in identity has proved insurmountable. So despite the existence of PKI and certificates and keys and all this other good stuff for absolutely years, we haven't really got any kind of universal infrastructure yet.
No.
So I think the thinking at the moment, and I think I'd probably subscribe to this, is that perhaps it's better to look for sectoral solutions rather than these great global solutions. So if I go into Barclays to open a bank account, you could imagine they issue me with some sort of financial services passport, and they stamp it with a visa, which allows me to visit the land of Barclays, right? So the next time I present that passport at the door of Barclays, whether it's the physical door or the website, the bank can see that visa and they can allow me in to sort of wander around. I mean, imagine it as like an app on my mobile phone or something. And it has a Barclays visa in it, so now I can visit Barclays. So now I want to go and open an account with NatWest. So I go to NatWest and I show them that passport and I prove it's mine through authentication and cryptography. And now they put a stamp in it which says I'm allowed to visit the land of NatWest. Now the Barclays visa and the NatWest visa are different. They're not the same thing. There's no particular reason why Barclays should be able to understand the NatWest visa and vice versa, but they're both stamped in the same passport, and Barclays can recognize theirs and NatWest can recognize theirs. And so now we're happy. And when I go to open another account, I ought to be able to choose whether to present the same passport and have a new visa stamped in it, or perhaps I want a different passport for some reason because I want a business passport and a personal passport or whatever. But you see the way the thinking's going on this. You have a passport that's recognized everywhere, and then you have visas which organizations can choose whether to recognize or not via sort of bilateral deals. And you can sort of picture how that could work. Now, until quite recently, the idea, and you see how that idea links with the ideas of KYC utilities, and more effective AML and better RegTech, because remember there are lots of people that are not financial institutions, e.g. lawyers and accountants and people like that, who also need to do KYC and would benefit from having the bank passport in place. Now, until quite recently, I would have said that we were only ever involved in discussions about two different architectures for that. In fact, I was a member of the Tech UK working group on financial services passport. And so I can remember how, there were the sort of broadly speaking, two areas were being discussed. So one is, well, what if there's a big database with all the passports in it somewhere? So there's like an Aadhaar of banking, right? Mm-hmm. We have a giant database that does biometrics and identification, authentication, and we put all the passports in that. But the banks didn't like that, and I think for very good reason. So one is, well, first of all, you'd have to create a new body to run it, and none of them were that enthusiastic about that. Unless, Swift for a while had, which actually was not a bad idea. I mean, Swift had this concept of the digital asset grid, which would be a sort of customer personal data store run by them. And actually, I mean, that wasn't a bad idea. But anyway, the banks didn't want to create a new... And also, you can see conceptually, they don't want to create something that's a new honeypot and a single point of failure, where if it gets hacked or goes down, then all of a sudden nobody can do any business. So then the idea was, well, what if we have some sort of federated solution, right? So each bank would manage its own. I go into Barclays, I get my passport. That passport's in a Barclays database somewhere, along with the visas. Now I go to NatWest, I point them to Barclays, and NatWest can talk to Barclays through, standard federation protocols to get access to the data if I authenticate it. And you could see, there's a sort of logic to that. And you could imagine some form of interchange scheme in place to make it work commercially, because obviously the smaller banks would find it cheaper to pay the bigger banks to use their passports rather than do the KYC themselves. So you could see a business model that went with that. But of course, what's happened in the last couple of years is the sneaky new technology of the blockchain has come up out of left field. And now people are starting to wonder, well, actually, what if we had something that it wasn't a central thing that belonged to all the banks, and it wasn't a thing that belonged to each of the banks, but what if it was something that belonged to none of the banks? So in other words, what if there was some sort of shared ledger that the banks were obliged to maintain as part of their KYC AML obligations, but also other people had access to, like the regulators and so on, but actually didn't belong to any of them. And at first, that seemed like nothing more than a mildly interesting idea. But of course, as time has gone on and discussions have begun to take on sort of more detailed examination of this idea, it seems like actually it's really not a bad idea. And so the concept that, obviously because of the Bitcoin heritage in the shared ledger space, people tend to think of money really as the dominant use. Although, of course, you can see plenty of people that say, well, Bitcoin's not a very good currency, it's not a very good payment system. I think we should at least be open to the possibility that actually the way in which shared ledgers are actually going to transform our industry is to do with identity and not to do with money at all.
Which is a great thing because, identity doesn't have a protocol, so to speak, and identity doesn't have a universal registry. Think of it, right now KYC is just KYC data, but it doesn't have the social signals embedded into it, government supplied information, professional membership or utility billing data, cross-validation by friends and family, etc. So I think the blockchain is, I don't know if it's the right solution or not to harmonize everything together. Whether that'll be the case or not, I think we'll find out. But the protocol that connects all identities together, we don't have one.
We don't. Although I think there are a lot of very smart people. The people I look to in this sort of space, people like Yves Mahler and so on. I think there are people out there who know how to design them, and we have rudiments in place. But at this instant, we have no global standard for representing the fact that I'm over 18. But I think if the business will to implement it was there, I don't think those technical problems are insurmountable. I think there are plenty of people out there that know how to solve those problems.
You look at countries like Pakistan and India, and a few others that have biometric data and is now collected for purposes of being issued the national identity card.
Yeah.
Can this data be tokenized and be accepted worldwide? Do you see this happening?
Well, you're introducing a very key word there, which is tokenization, and I think that's crucial to it. So certainly in a country like the UK, people would be very uncomfortable with an Aadhaar-like solution. So the idea that you have a single, there's a single you, and everything you do, you have to show that you're you,
without sharing the actual data.
Yeah, without sharing the actual data, although.
It can be validated.
I have heard people say, look, I have heard people say, well, one day it's all going to show up on WikiLeaks anyway, so why worry about it? But there are cultural issues here, and I think in the UK and America that would be quite difficult to do. I think that it's a little bit lazy, but you can sort of culturally group things into what you might look at a sort of Asian perspective, where you have the big central database, and the utility of that is so great. I mean, because it helps millions of people to transact where they couldn't do before. That's the dominant factor. You could, you have a sort of Scandinavian kind of model where it's the banks that provide the core identity, and the government use that. You have the sort of growing but not quite there yet Anglo-Saxon model, where the government provides the framework, but it's private companies that provide the actual identities themselves, albeit potentially using government identities as root identities to it. You have a sort of continental European version of it, where the government provides a digital identity, and the private sector makes use of that. I mean, you do see these different models, and I'm not smart enough to know which of them is optimum for each zone, although I can see they're different. But I think I would be prepared to argue that if we created a sort of standard kind of passport for financial services, then there would be certain characteristics like privacy, which we would want built in as part of the infrastructure, and I can sort of see how that would work. So, for example, if you're a bank and you want to see my financial services passport, you would be allowed to see certain parts of it by me or by whoever was holding it. But if you were, not a bank, there'd be some parts of it you couldn't see. That seems sort of reasonable. And I think, the word that's sort of growing up around this, which I played a part in, I have to say, the word that's growing up is translucency. We have a shared ledger that contains translucent transactions. And if I want to see, so for example, if I come to open an account with you, instead of showing you a passport, I point you to where that passport is on the shared ledger, and you yourself can traverse the shared ledger to see whether that passport has been revoked or updated or deleted or changed. You can easily satisfy yourself it isn't. Then you need to know, is it actually my passport? So then you need to force a cryptographic challenge. And of course, because I'm in theory at least the only person who has the public key, I'm the only person who has the private key. I'm the only person that can answer that challenge. So then it's me. There is a kind of logic to it. And of course, in the real world, since I wouldn't want the responsibility of having to manage the public key, and you can see the logic to it, of course, because in the real world, where I wouldn't want the responsibility of having to manage the private key myself, that's what Barclays would do for me. I want a regulated financial institution to look after that key. I don't want the responsibility of having to look after it.
So something like a multi-sig custodial services.
Yes, and the I have seen some interesting proposals for. I'm sure you've seen these ideas floating around for the N from M recoveries, which say, well, actually, maybe you don't need a bank to look after it because you could have it kind of shared between your friends and all that sort of thing. And I think that might be true for some kinds of identity downstream, but for the kind of financial services identity that we're thinking about right now, it seems to me rather obvious that it should be the bank that looks after it.
So, David, you go to many conferences, you meet many people. Do you see bankers opening up and financial institutions and regulators opening up to this new identity framework that may be rolling out? I'm sure there are hundreds of companies, startups working on it. But do you see them?
No, there are some fantastic startups in this space. I learn something every time I go to one of these events because there are people looking at this in a new way. And the vigor in that space is wonderful, and it's long overdue. On the regulator side, I can't point to any. Personally, I think I've been unsuccessful at communicating to regulators and to lawmakers what the possibilities of the new identity infrastructure might be, and that's definitely an area where I personally need to get better.
You travel both the developed world and the developing world. Is there an example or two from the developing world, third world countries, where you are clearly impressed by what they're doing in the identity space? Could be anything, identity, not necessarily identity, but even payments or behavior.
Well, look, I think, in the developed world, of course, we have in many places an identity infrastructure, albeit imperfect, which we've been trying to digitize. And we have a variety of parallel structures that act as proxies for one, like credit reference agencies and things like that. In the developing world, you don't have that. And so, as in so many other ways, of course, it's the mobile phone that has stepped in to do this. And I think one of the most interesting, and I mean, I bore people by saying this to them all the time, but I think one of the most interesting outcomes of the early mobile money experiments in places like, Kenya and so on, was the extent to which the transactional histories were able to act as substitutes for conventional identification services like credit referencing and so on. So if I wanted to show you that, so let's say I'm coming to you for a job, right? And so I log into my mobile money account and I show you, look, I send money up country every month. I pay the school fees every month. Those transactional histories, because they now exist and are trusted, because previously I was doing all of this in cash, so I would have no history or evidence of any of those. The extent to which, though, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the same kind of stories about, people being, looking at those transactional records when you're assessing whether, and then of course you had companies that came into that space that began to look at providing financial services on the basis of those transactional histories. So I think, if there's a lesson from the developing world, it's the jump into the mobile space and some of the unexpected outcomes there. And there are people who are much bigger experts on this than me, who I'm sure would have even more examples of how these things have happened.
Before the podcast, we were talking about what you were doing today, and you cited that you are now working on a new book. Would you like to give us some hints as to what the new book is about and when it will come out?
Well, I decided one of the interesting things that came up in writing the previous book was one or two speculative things about the future.
Just so for everyone else, is Identity is the New Money, and it came out in, I believe, 2014, if I'm not
mistaken. Yeah, it's came out a couple of years ago now, but it is still available at all good bookshops, and I dare say some of the bad ones too. So
it is a must-read. I tell people,
thank you.
It is a very, very decent read.
Thank you. And I touched in one or two places on the future of money, and one or two people who read the book, and actually one or two of the reviewers of the book who said some very kind things about it, said that actually some of the ideas about the future of money itself were interesting and should be explored more. And so I thought, well, actually, what I'll do then is I'll sit down and write something just about the money side of things. And and of course, I have to have a model in my head, like I do for everything. And so I came up with what I thought was like a fun way of thinking about money. And so I pitched it to a couple of people. I said, well, look, here's my idea, right? So we have money 1.0, which is atoms, right? Mm-hmm. Gold or cowrie shells or whale's teeth or whatever you want. And then we found a way to send those electronically by telegraph initially, and then other ways. And that became money 2.0, which was bits about atoms. And then the atoms went away completely, and we had money 3.0, which is just bits. So I thought that's like a fun way of thinking about, the history of money. And then my idea was, actually, we're already in money 3.0, right? Because that actually started back in 1971. And the reason people like me date it specifically to 1971 is because that's when Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of gold into dollars. So since 1971, dollars have just been bits. You can't convert them into gold anymore. So actually, we've been living in the future of money for a while. But I think many people's mental models of money still date back to Money 2.0. So people, I mean, I was interviewed by a journalist, a very intelligent journalist from a very reputable paper, who from her question made it clear that she thought that somehow there was still gold in the Bank of England somewhere, that stood behind £5 notes, which of course hasn't been true since the 1930s.
Or the Fort Knox.
Or Fort Knox. And so that gave me an idea. You need an idea for a book to move. And so that was my kind of idea. We're living in the future, but people don't think of it like that. And then I started to think, well, okay, if you really sit down and really think about the future of money, if you don't think about it, you end up in Star Trek and you have galactic credits and all this sort of thing. And you walk into a bar in Alpha Centauri and you pay with a galactic credit and the barman says, thank you very much. When we already know that euros don't really work between Germany and Greece. So how they're going to work between here and Alpha Centauri, I haven't really any idea at all. And that led me into thinking perhaps the future, because of the decentralizing nature of the technology, whether it's Bitcoin or smart chips or mobile phones or anything else, what if the future of money is actually more kinds of money, not fewer? And I think that was an interesting idea to play with. And so that's kind of what the book is about.
Did you take any cue from the visionary Gene Roddenberry?
Well, of course, what are the Ferengi? I forgot what the currency they use is. Ferengi iron bars or something, don't they? That's latium, isn't it, or something like that? Yeah. Well, of course, in Star Trek, his vision was of a communist superstate, of course, where actually nobody had to do any work and all goods were produced for everybody. So there was no money. It's a common theme of utopias, actually, that they don't have money in them, because it's assumed that the system can take care of producing everything it wants. So those kind of utopias don't really have money in them. Who knows? I might be wrong, and we might be heading towards that because of robotics and 3D replicators and all that sort of thing. But that might be a bit further away. So in the short term, I suspect the technology means that more people will be able to start their own money, and there'll be more different kinds of money, and people will choose the money they use on a slightly different basis. I can give you a very trivial and simple example. Suppose there was some form of Islamic electronic dinar, which was a global non-interest bearing currency. Then lots of people might want to use that currency, not because of any kind of economic calculation, but because it represents values that they support. The money represents the values of the community that it serves. And so you could see that, just in the same way that we expect machines to take care of other things for us, we might expect machines to take care of that kind of thing too. So I might give my phone a general policy about money. These are the kinds of money I like. Or I might download a policy from somebody that I trust. And then actually I will never deal with all these different kinds of money, because my phone will take care of it. And if my phone knows that I'm going on holiday to Germany next month, then my phone will execute the appropriate strategies to lay in the monies that I need for that travel. I will never see them, right? Because when I look at my phone tells me, well, you've got, or whatever, perhaps I've set my phone to optimize for my retirement. So my phone tells me, well, you've got X kilowatt hours of electricity, and you've got Y days in hospital, and you've got Z units of penicillin. I mean, maybe that's what I want to see on my phone, right? And when I walk into your store in Germany, my phone and your phone are perfectly capable of negotiating which currencies they want to trade and move around or whatever. I personally will never see that. So yes. So my thinking is we're going to move towards a world of more currencies, not fewer. And of course, there is one rather interesting difference about those new currencies, which is that they'll be implemented by smart money. So
it's not just intelligent money; it's smart money that comes with values. Moral,
it's easy to see this because
society.
A dollar bill
It's just a dollar
has
bill.
no memory.
Yeah.
A dollar bill doesn't know where it be.
That's a great thing you just said. It has no memory.
Right. But a Bitcoin does.
Yeah.
You can look and if I say, you know what, I know this is going to sound a silly example, right? So I don't like gambling. Okay. So I refuse to accept any Bitcoins that have been involved in gambling transactions. That seems like a crazy thing to say because you can't do that with dollar bills or M-Pesa balances. But actually, you could imagine forms of smart money which could not only reflect the values of their communities, but actually, execute programmable money that actually supports and enhances the values of its community. And that takes us into a very different world. And it's an interesting thing to speculate about. So I thought I would write about that and help people think about where money is going in a slightly, I hope, a slightly different way.
So the book is actually going to be extrapolating what money may look like in the future, correct?
Yeah. So I've written a very trivial and superficial history just to make some points about the relationship between technology and money. So we talk about Money 1.0 and my favorite topics like tally sticks and this kind of thing. And then we talk about Money 2.0 and, the electronic transfer of money and this kind of thing. And then we talk about Money 3.0, the end of cash and where money might go next. And I have this 5 C's model of who might issue money in the future. The 5 C's being central banks, commercial banks, companies, cryptography, or of course my favorite, communities.
Very nice. And when does the book come out, if I may ask?
It depends whether they send it. I'm going to send it in at the end of this week to the publishers, and if they don't send it back on Monday, then hopefully a couple of months' time.
Well, sir. David, as always, it has been an honor talking to you.
Oh, it was fantastic to talk to you as always, Faisal.
And thank you very much for your time. And hopefully,
no, you're more than welcome.
We'll have this up and running. And thank you, sir. Take care.
So look forward to seeing you again. Bye, Faisal.
Bye-bye.